My name is Martha Jane Hemlock. I'm 78 years old and I poisoned and killed my 5 children. Just got out of prison after 10 years and here I am sitting on this old porch in Millbrook County like I'm just another grandma with her sweet tea and her quilting. But I ain't just another grandma, am I? The whole world thinks they know what I done. They painted me as a monster. A woman who turned on her own blood during what was supposed to be a family dinner. 10 years behind bars. 10 years of cold concrete. And whispered curses from other inmates who couldn't stomach what I'd been convicted of. Even murderers got standards, they'd say. Even killers draw the line somewhere. They don't know the real story, though. They don't know why a mother who spent every waking moment loving her babies would choose to stop their hearts forever. They don't know about the empire my children built, about the golden mansion they put me in. Or about the night I discovered that my 5 beautiful babies had become something so dark that killing them was the only way to save other people's children. See, I've been carrying this burden alone for too long now. My hands shake something fierce these days. And sometimes I can't remember if something happened on a Tuesday or a Wednesday. The mind plays tricks when you get to be my age. But what I feel, what I know in my bones about that terrible night, that's clear as morning dew on summer grass. You might wonder how someone like me, someone who barely made it through 8th grade, can tell a story like this with any kind of sense. Truth is, I always had a way with words. Spent my years listening to radio preachers and letting other folks' voices teach me how to find my own. Prison gave me plenty of time to think about how to say things right. So I'm going to tell you everything. Not the version they put in the newspapers, not the story that got me convicted, but the real one. The one about 5 children who built something beautiful on the outside and something rotten to the core underneath. About a mother who had to choose between her own soul and the innocent lives her babies were destroying. If you're willing to sit here with me while I unpack this burden. If you're ready to hear why sometimes a mother's greatest act of love looks like the most unforgivable sin, then we got ourselves a story to tell. And every word of it is true. I reckon I should start with how proud I was of them children. Lord, you never seen a mother more full of pride than I was watching my 5 babies grow up and make something of themselves. Jediah, my firstborn, had this smile that could charm the paint off a barn door. When my only girl, sweet as honey and twice as golden. Then came Gideon with his quiet with Cletus, who could count stars like they was pennies, and little Abner, always tinkering with things, saying he was going to invent machines to make the whole world happy. We didn't have much when they were small. I'm talking about the kind of poor where you count every grain of rice, where Christmas presents came from the church charity box, and where I'd go to bed hungry so they could have seconds. But somehow, some way, they all turned out smart as whips. Got scholarships, went to them fancy colleges, came back home with degrees and dreams bigger than our little county could hold. By the time they was all grown, they'd built themselves an empire called Pinnacle Holdings. Don't ask me what all they did. Something with investments and properties and numbers that made my head spin. All I knew was that money started flowing like water after a spring rain. They bought me a mansion. Can you picture that? Me, Martha Jane Hemlock, who used to patch holes in the walls with newspaper, living in a house with more rooms than I could count. But the thing that made me proudest wasn't the money. It was their hearts. See, they started this charity called the Hearthlight Foundation. Said it was to help children who came from nothing just like they did. Poor kids who needed a chance, needed someone to believe in them. They'd hold these fancy galas, invite all the important people from 3 counties over, raise thousands of dollars for children's homes and schools. I'd sit at them fancy tables in my silk dresses. Lord, can you imagine me in silk watching my babies give speeches about helping the less fortunate? And I'd think to myself, Martha Jane, you done something right. You raised children who remember where they came from. The foundation had pictures everywhere. Smiling children, new playground equipment, clean dormitories. My Ran would tell me stories about the little girls they helped, how they'd take them from terrible situations and give them hope. Abner would show me letters from grateful families. They made me the honorary president, put my picture in all their brochures. The matriarch of giving, they called me. For nigh on 15 years, I lived in that golden bubble, thinking I'd raised 5 angels who'd been blessed by the Almighty Himself. I'd wake up every morning in that big house, look out at the perfectly manicured gardens, and thank God for giving me children who turn their blessings into blessings for others. I should have known it was too good to be true. Should have asked more questions about where all that money really came from. Should have wondered why they never let me visit the children's homes they talked about. Should have paid attention to the way they'd changed the subject when I wanted to meet some of them grateful families. But I was so proud, so grateful, so blinded by the life they had given me that I never thought to look behind the curtain they'd hung up so pretty. And that was my first mistake. My biggest sin wasn't what I'd done to them at the end. It was what I didn't see for all them years before that Tuesday. Or maybe it was a Wednesday. Lord forgive me. The days all run together sometimes when everything started falling apart. It began with something so small. An email that wasn't meant for my eyes. That email came on what I remember was a hot afternoon in July, though it might have been August. The summers all blur together when you get to be my age. The air conditioning in that big house was humming something fierce. But I was in the kitchen anyway, making peach cobbler from the tree out. Old habits, you know. Even in a mansion I still found my comfort in that kitchen. Still rolled dough with the same wooden pin my mama gave me 40 years before. Abner had left his laptop on the kitchen counter. That boy was always forgetting things, scattered as seed in the wind since he was little. The thing kept making that dinging sound, emails coming in faster than rain on a tin roof. Now, I wasn't one to go poking through other folks' business, but one of them messages popped up right there on the screen, and I couldn't help but see. It was from someone with a name I didn't recognize, Marcus Thornfield or something like that. The subject line said, "Shipment delayed. Merchandise. Quality concerns." I thought maybe it was about the foundation, about supplies. For one of them children's homes getting held up. You know how it is when you're trying to help kids. Every day counts. Every delay means more suffering. So I opened it. Lord help me. Opened it. The words didn't make sense at first. Kept talking about quality control and age verification and client preferences. Mentioned something about a shipment of 12 units being rejected because they were too damaged and needed to be replaced with fresh inventory. There was talk about breaking in procedures and transport protocols and numbers. Lord, such horrible numbers about profit, margins and client satisfaction. I stood there in that bright kitchen, flour on my hands and the smell of peaches in the air, reading words that felt like they was written in a foreign language. Mine kept trying to make them make sense. Kept trying to fit them into the picture I had of my children's business. Maybe it was about furniture for the children's homes or supplies that got damaged in shipping. But then I got to the last paragraph. The one that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. Vance girl has been particularly problematic. Suggest immediate disposal and replacement. Foundation cover story is wearing thin with local authorities. Recommend shifting operations to the coastal facility until heat dies down. Vance girl foundation cover story. I must have read them words 20 times, 30 times till they burned themselves into my brain like a brand. My hands started shaking so bad I had to set the laptop down before I dropped it. The kitchen suddenly felt cold as a tomb. Despite that air conditioning working overtime, I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe they was talking about employees who wasn't working out. Or maybe it was some kind of code for something innocent that I just didn't understand on account of not having their education. But deep in my bones, in that place where a mother's instincts live, I knew better. I knew I just read something that would change everything. Something that would make me question every golden thread in the life my children had woven around me. Peach cobbler burned that day. First time in 50 years I'd ever let a dessert burn. But I just stood there staring at that screen until the smoke alarm started screaming and brought me back to myself. That night at dinner, I watched my babies differently. Watched how Ren smiled when she talked about visiting the children's home in Riverside County. Watched how Jediah's eyes went cold when he mentioned problematic situations that needed handling. Watched how they all exchanged looks when I asked too many questions about this Vance girl they'd mentioned. They were still my children, still had the same faces I'd kissed goodnight for 20 years, but something had shifted. Like when you're walking through familiar woods, and suddenly realize you don't recognize the path. I didn't sleep that night. Just lay there in that big bed in that beautiful room, staring at the ceiling, and trying to convince myself that my imagination was running wild. That grief and loneliness was making me see monsters where there wasn't none. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just gotten my first real look at who my children had become when they thought nobody was watching. The next few days passed like I was walking through thick molasses. Every conversation with my children felt different, like I was hearing their voices through water. They'd talk about the foundation, about the children they was helping, and all I could think about was them cold words in that email. Disposal and replacement and merchandise. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. Ren would get phone calls at all hours and step out to the garden to take them, speaking in whispers. How Gideon kept files locked up tight in his office, never letting me dust in there like I did the rest of the house. How they'd all go quiet when I walked into a room, like I'd interrupted something important. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. I'm sure it was Thursday because that's when I always did the washing. And I remember hanging clothes on the line when I heard the cars pulling up the long driveway. 3 black cars, expensive ones with tinted windows, moving slow and deliberate like a funeral procession. I watched from behind the curtains as men in dark suits got out, and my Jediah went to meet them. Even from that distance I could see something was wrong with the way they was all standing, tense like animals sensing a storm coming. But it wasn't the men that made my heart stop. It was what I saw when they opened the trunk of the middle car. Little girl. Couldn't have been more than 12. 13 at most. She was so thin her clothes hung on her like they was made for someone twice her size. Her dark hair was matted. And even from my window I could see she was shaking. Not from cold 'cause it was hotter than blazes that day, but from pure terror. She kept looking around like a trapped animal. And when one of them men put his hand on her shoulder to guide her toward the house, she flinched like she'd been struck. That's when I saw her face clear. And Lord help me, I ain't never going to forget them eyes. Big and dark and full of a kind of fear that no child should ever know. They brought her right to my front door. My front door. The same door where I used to greet church ladies with fresh cookies and neighbors borrowing cups of sugar. Jedediah came inside. First, his face all business, followed by two of them suited men and the little girl walking between them like she was in chains. Though I couldn't see none, she kept her head down, wouldn't look at nothing or nobody. Mama, Jedediah said, and his voice was different, colder than I'd ever heard it. This is Era. She's going to be staying with us for a few days while we sort out her situation. Era, even her name sounded scared when he said it. I looked at that child and every instinct I had as a mother started screaming. This wasn't no charity case. This wasn't no grateful family sending their daughter to thank us for our generosity. This was something else entirely. Something that made my skin crawl and my heart pound like a drum in my chest. Where's her family? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Where's her mama? The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jedediah and his men exchanged looks, and I saw something pass between them that chilled me to the bone. She don't have no family that wants her, he said finally. We're helping her find a new situation, better opportunities. That's when little Aurora looked up at me for the first time, and I saw something in them dark eyes that nearly brought me to my knees. 'Twas a look that said, "Help me," louder than any scream ever could. A look that said, she knew exactly what kind of opportunities they was talking about. Wanted to grab that child and run. Wanted to scoop her up and drive her straight to the sheriff's office and demand answers. But my feet felt rooted to the floor, and my voice caught in my throat like I'd swallowed sand. Because in that moment, standing in my beautiful foyer with my successful son and that terrified little girl, I finally understood what I had been reading in them emails. I understood what kind of foundation my children had really built. What kind of opportunities they was really providing. And I understood that I was standing in the middle of something so evil, so unthinkable that my mind couldn't quite wrap itself around the full horror of it. They took Alara upstairs to what used to be my sewing room. I listened to their footsteps overhead, heard a door close and lock, heard nothing else for the rest of the night. No matter how hard I strained to listen, that was the moment. I knew there wasn't no going back. Whatever innocence I'd had left, whatever beautiful illusions I'd been living in, they died right therein. That foyer with the sound of a lock turning on a little girl's prison. Raised monsters, and I'd been living off their blood money for years. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. Just lay there listening to the old house settling, straining my ears for any sound from stairs. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard crying, soft, muffled, like someone trying real hard not to make noise. It was coming from my old sewing room where they'd locked that poor child. I got up and crept to the bottom of the stairs, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. Every step creaked like a gunshot in the quiet house, but I had to try. Had to see if I could help her somehow. Maybe slip her some food or just let her know she wasn't alone in this nightmare. But when I got halfway up them stairs, I heard footsteps in the hallway above. Heavy ones. Men's shoes on the wooden floor, moving back and forth like someone was standing guard. They wasn't taking no chances with that little girl getting away. I stood there, in my nightgown, gripping the banister so tight my knuckles went white. And I made a decision that changed everything. I was going to confront my children. I was going to demand they let that child And if they wouldn't listen, I was going to call the sheriff myself. Blood. Or no blood. Morning came slow as cold honey. I got dressed in my best church dress, navy blue with little white flowers. And I put on my pearl earrings, the ones my mama gave me. If I was going to face my children with the truth, I was going to do it with dignity. I found them all in the dining room having their breakfast like nothing had happened. Like they didn't have a terrified child locked upstairs like some kind of prisoner. Jedediah was reading his newspaper. Ren was checking her phone and the boys was talking about some business meeting later that day. We need to talk, I said, standing in the doorway with my hands folded in front of me. About that little girl upstairs. The silence that fell over that room was thick as molasses. 5 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. And I saw something in them faces that I'd never seen before. Not guilt, not shame, but calculation. Like they was figuring out how much trouble I was going to be. Sit down, Mama, Ren said, her voice sweet as pie but with an edge to it I'd never heard. Let's have some coffee and talk about this reasonably. I don't want no coffee, I said, my voice stronger than I felt. I want to know what you've done to that child. And I want to know what kind of business you're really running. That's when Jedediah sat down his newspaper and looked at me with eyes cold as January ice. Mama, you're getting yourself worked up over nothing. The girl is fine. She's being taken care of. Taken care of. My voice was rising now and I couldn't stop it. She's locked in a room like a prisoner. She's scared out of her mind. What kind of care is that? Gideon cleared his throat. That quiet way he'd always had since he was little. Maybe you should go back to your room, Mama. Rest a bit. Seem confused. Confused. Like I was some old fool who didn't know what she was seeing. With her own eyes. That's when I told them about the email, about what I'd read, about the words that had been eating at me for days. I watched their faces change as I spoke. Watched them go from dismissive to alert to something harder, more dangerous. You've been snooping, Abner said. And his voice wasn't my baby boy's voice anymore. Was the voice of a stranger wearing my son's face. I wasn't snooping, I said. It was right there on your computer. And now I want answers. What happened next? I still have trouble believing. Even though I lived it, my 5 children, my babies that I'd nursed and rocked and sang to sleep, they looked at each other across that breakfast table. And I saw them make a decision without saying a word. Rin spoke first, her voice calm as still water. Mama, you're right. We haven't been completely honest with you about our business. And then they told me, not everything but enough. Enough to make me understand that the email wasn't no mistake, wasn't no misunderstanding. They told me about opportunities they provided for certain clients, about how the foundation was their hunting ground, how they identified vulnerable children with no one to miss them, about how profitable it was, how careful they was, how they'd built something bigger than I could imagine. They talked about it like it was any other business. Like they was discussing livestock or inventory or quarterly reports. No shame, no guilt, no recognition that what they was describing was the most evil thing I could imagine. When I started crying, when I begged them to stop, to let that little girl go, they just looked at me with something between pity and irritation. This is why we didn't tell you before, Clelit said. We knew you wouldn't understand the complexities. Complexities. That's what they called it. That child upstairs, I whispered, my voice barely holding together. What's going to happen to her? She's merchandise, Mama, Jedediah said, like he was explaining something simple to a slow child. Valuable merchandise. She'll be taken care of until she's delivered to her new situation. Merchandise. My grandchild, because that's how I thought of every child in need was. Merchandise to them. That's when I knew with a certainty that cut through me like lightning that my children was already dead, had been dead for years. Probably these things sitting at my breakfast table, wearing their faces and speaking with their voices. They wasn't the babies I'd raised. They were something else entirely. Something that had grown in the dark places where love used to live. But I also knew something else. I knew that little girl upstairs was going to disappear, just like God knows how many others had disappeared. And I knew that tomorrow or next week or next month there'd be another one and another one after that. And I knew that I was the only person in the world who could stop it. The rest of that morning passed in a kind of terrible dream. Children finished their breakfast like nothing had happened. Like they hadn't just told me they was running the most evil business I could imagine. They talked about meetings and appointments. Kissed my cheek goodbye one by one like they'd done every day for years. But everything was different now. The kisses felt cold. Their voices sounded hollow. Even the way they moved through the house seemed calculated, like actors playing parts they'd memorized but didn't feel. After they left, I sat in that big dining room for the longest time, staring at the leftover coffee cups and crumpled napkins. The house felt different too, bigger and emptier, but also somehow pressing in on me from all sides. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps I couldn't trust. I thought about calling the sheriff. Must have picked up that phone a dozen times, my finger hovering over the numbers. But every time I started to dial, I'd think about what I was going to say. How was I going to explain that my own children, the ones who'd built the biggest charity in 3 counties, who'd been featured in the newspaper for their good works, was actually monsters? Who was going to believe me? An old woman with an 8th grade education against 5 successful business people with degrees and connections and more money than most folks could imagine. They'd think I was confused. Maybe getting that disease where your mind starts slipping. Maybe my children would even help that story along. Talk about how poor old mama was. Getting confused in her old age. Seeing things that wasn't there. Around noon I heard a car coming up the drive. Not one of my children's cars. This one sounded different, older. I looked out the front window and saw a beat-up sedan pulling up, dust flying behind it like a brown cloud. A woman got out, small and thin, with graying hair pulled back tight. She looked nervous, kept glancing around like she was afraid of being seen. Knocked on my door real soft, barely loud enough to hear. When I opened it, she was already backing away like she was ready to run. She told me her name was Carol Vance, and she was looking for her granddaughter, a little girl named Alara who'd gone missing 3 days ago, from a group home in the next county. The police wasn't taking it serious, she said, because children from the home went missing all the time and usually turned up somewhere else in the system. But Carol knew different. She'd been asking questions, following leads that the police wouldn't follow. Someone had told her they'd seen a girl matching's description being brought to my house in black car. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might burst right out of my chest. This woman, this grandmother, who was probably just a few years younger than me, was standing on my doorstep looking for the same little girl I'd seen them bring in yesterday. I wanted to tell her everything. Wanted to grab her hand and take her straight upstairs to that locked room and prove that her granddaughter was here, was alive, was in terrible danger. Something stopped me. Maybe the way my children had looked at me that morning. Maybe the cold certainty in their voices when they'd called merchandise because I realized something that chilled me to the bone. If Carol was here asking questions following leads, then my children already knew about her. They had to know. And if they knew someone was looking for someone who cared enough to track her here, Carol Vance was in just as much danger as her granddaughter. I told her I didn't know nothing about no missing girl, that she must have the wrong house. The lie tasted like poison in my mouth, but I told it anyway because I could see one of the black cars sitting at the end of the driveway, just barely visible through the trees. Someone was watching, waiting to see what this woman was going to do. Carol's face crumpled when I said it, and I saw the hope die in her eyes. She thanked me anyway, polite as could be, and asked if I'd call her if I heard anything. She pressed a piece of paper into my hand with her phone number written on it in shaky handwriting. Watched her drive away, and I knew I'd probably just signed that woman's death warrant along with her granddaughter's, because my children didn't leave loose ends. They didn't let people ask questions or follow leads or get too close to the truth that evening when they all came home. I noticed things I'd missed before. How they had new phones they kept separate from their regular ones. How they talked in code about deliveries and clients and inventory management. How they'd step outside to take certain calls, speaking in voices too low for me to hear. And I noticed something else. The way they looked at me, calculating, assessing, like they was trying to figure out if I was going to be a problem they needed to solve. Jediah mentioned over dinner that they'd had some unexpected visitors that day. Someone asking questions they shouldn't be asking, poking around where they didn't belong. He said it real casual, but his eyes was on me when he said it. I kept my face blank as fresh paper, but inside I was screaming because I knew what unexpected visitors meant in their world. I knew what happened to people who asked too many questions. That night I lay in bed listening to cars come and go in the driveway. Heard voices in the yard, footsteps on the gravel. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, everything went quiet again. But it was the kind of quiet that follows something terrible. Never saw Carol Vance again. The next day's newspaper had a small story on page 6 about a single car accident on Route 47. A woman from the next county had apparently fallen asleep at the wheel and driven into a tree. Whoa. Witnesses, no other cars involved. Just another tragic accident in a world full of them. But I knew better. I knew that my children had just murdered a grandmother whose only crime was loving her granddaughter enough to come looking for her. And I knew that if I wasn't careful, if I pushed too hard or asked too many questions, I'd be next. The days after Carol Vance died, and Lord help me, I knew in my bones it wasn't no accident. I started seeing my house different. What used to feel like a blessing now felt like a beautiful prison. Every room had ears. Every corner had eyes. And I was the fool who'd been living in luxury built on the suffering of children. I'd walk past that locked door upstairs and hear nothing. Not crying, not moving around, nothing at all. The silence was worse than screams would have been, because silence meant that little Era was giving up hope, or worse, that she wasn't in there anymore at all. 3 days after the accident, I finally worked up the courage to test that door when the house was empty. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely turn the knob, but it was locked tight as a vault. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened with everything I had. But all I heard was my own heart hammering against my ribs. That's when I found the key. It was hanging on a little hook inside Jedediah's desk drawer, mixed in with paper clips and rubber bands like it wasn't nothing important. Just a small, brass key that could have opened anything. But something about the way it was hidden. Not really hidden, just tucked away. Casual like made my stomach turn. Took it. Lord forgive me. Stole from my own son. But I took that key and slipped it into my bra where it lay against my heart like a cold promise. That afternoon, when all 5 of them was gone to some business meeting in the city, I climbed them. Stairs with my knees shaking like autumn leaves. The key fit perfect, turned. Smooth as butter. And the door swung open on what used to be my bright, cheerful sewing room. It was empty. Not just no era. Everything was gone. My sewing machine, my fabric bins, my grandmother's rocking chair that I'd nursed all my babies in. The room had been stripped bare except for a single mattress on the floor and heavy curtains blocking out every bit of sunlight. The smell, Lord, the smell in that room told me everything I needed to know. Fear and desperation and something else, something sweet and sick that made my stomach lurch. It was the smell of hopelessness, of children who'd given up believing anyone was coming to save. Found other things too. Things that made me understand this wasn't the first time that room had been used for such evil purposes. Scratches on the wooden floor like fingernails had clawed at them. Stains on the walls that could have been anything, but probably wasn't anything good. And in the corner so small I almost missed it. A little heart, carved into the baseboard with what looked like a hairpin or a nail. Inside the heart were initials. V. Laravance. That poor child had carved her name into my house like she was trying to leave some proof she'd existed. Some sign that she'd been there. I ran my finger over them little letters. And I swear I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart that had been breaking for days. Something deeper. Something that had been holding me together all these years. Maybe it was my faith in my children. Or my belief that love could overcome anything. Or just my stubborn hope that there was still some good left in this situation. Whatever it was, it snapped clean in two. And what was left was something harder, something angrier. Something that knew exactly what needed to be done. That evening at dinner, I watched my children eat the pot roast I'd made, watched them laugh and talk about their day like they was normal. People with normal lives. But all I could see was that empty room upstairs. All I could smell was the fear that little girl had left behind. When mentioned they was having another foundation gala next month. Said they was expecting to raise more money than ever before. She asked if I wanted a new dress for the occasion. Something pretty. To make me feel special. Said yes. I'd love a new dress. And I smiled when I said it. Smiled like the proud mama I'd always been. But inside I was planning. Because I'd realized something sitting in that stripped bare room, running my fingers over a scared little girl's carved initials. I'd realized that all my crying and pleading and trying to appeal to whatever goodness might be left in my children, none of that was going to save the next or the one after. That or the dozens that would come after them. They wasn't going to stop. They was too far gone, too comfortable with their evil, too convinced that what they was doing was just business. And as long as they was alive and free, children was going to keep disappearing into that room upstairs. Keep carving their initials into the walls before they disappeared forever. I thought about poor Carol Vance, how she'd died trying to save her granddaughter, how she'd failed because she'd tried to work within the system, tried to get help from people who either couldn't or wouldn't see the truth. But I wasn't going to make the same mistake. Wasn't going to call the sheriff or try to gather evidence or hope that someone else would fix what my children had become. I was going to fix it myself. That night, I went down to the kitchen and started looking through my spice. Started remembering things my grandmother had taught me about plants and herbs, about which ones could heal, and which ones could harm. Started thinking about family recipes that could be changed just a little bit to serve a different kind of purpose. I was going to cook for my children one last time. Going to make them a meal they'd never forget. And when it was over, when they was all gone and could never hurt another child again, I was going to call the sheriff myself and tell him exactly what I'd done and why I'd done it. Because some sins can only be washed away with blood. And sometimes the only person who can stop a monster is the person who made them in the first place. The next 2 weeks passed like I was living in two different worlds at the same time. On the outside, I was still the same Martha Jane I'd always been. Making breakfast, tending my little herb garden, sitting on the porch with my sweet tea, watching the corn grow tall in the summer heat. But on the inside I was becoming something else entirely, something harder and colder and more determined than I'd ever been in my life. I started paying attention to things I'd never noticed before. My children's schedules worked, when they was all likely to be home at the same time, what their favorite foods was, which dishes would make them happy enough to eat without suspicion. I watched them like I was studying strangers, memorizing their habits and their weaknesses, and I started preparing. My grandmother, God rest her soul, had taught me things about plants that most folks had forgotten, which herbs could settle a stomach, and which ones could stop a heart, which mushrooms were safe to eat, and which ones would send you to meet your maker. She'd grown up in the old times, when women had to know such things to protect their families from all kinds of dangers. I'd never thought I'd need that knowledge. Never imagined I'd be grateful for lessons learned at the knee of a woman who'd lived through wars and famines and times when knowing the difference between medicine and poison could mean the difference between life and death. But I was grateful now. I spent my afternoons in the woods behind the house, gathering things that looked innocent enough. Mushrooms that grew in the damp places under fallen logs. Berries that was pretty to look at, but deadly to eat. Roots that could be ground up fine and mixed into gravies and sauces without changing the taste much. Each time I came back to the house with my little basket, I felt like I was carrying pieces of justice, like the earth itself was helping me do what needed to be done. But the hardest part wasn't gathering what I needed. The hardest part was living with my children every day, looking at their faces across the dinner table, and knowing what I was planning to do to them. Because they were still my babies, wasn't they? Phil had the same eyes I'd looked into when they was newborns. Still had the same hands I'd held when they was learning to. When Abner would kiss my cheek goodnight, I could still smell the little boy's sweetness under his expensive cologne. When Ren would laugh at something on her phone, it was the same laugh that used to make me smile. When she was 5 years old, sometimes late at night, I'd almost talk myself out of it, almost convince myself that maybe there was another way, that maybe I could find some evidence the police would believe, that maybe my children could be saved somehow. But then I'd remember that empty room upstairs. I'd remember Carol Vance's crumpled face when I lied to her, and how she died alone on a dark road because she'd loved her granddaughter enough to come looking. I'd remember all the children who'd probably carved their initials in that baseboard before, all the ones who disappeared without a trace while I lived in my beautiful house and congratulated myself on raising such successful kids. And I'd know that what I was planning wasn't just necessary. It was the only decent thing left for me. Do. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday evening when Jedidiah got a phone call that made his face go white as fresh cotton. He stepped out onto the back porch to take it. But the kitchen window was open and I heard every word. Someone was asking questions. Someone from the state police, apparently, who'd connected the disappearances of several children from different counties. They was looking into charitable organizations, trying to find patterns, following money trails. When Jedidiah came back inside, he called a family meeting right there in the kitchen. 5 of them huddled around the table, speaking in voices barely above whispers. But I caught enough to understand that they were scared. Really scared. Maybe for the first time since they'd started their evil business. They talked about moving operations somewhere else, maybe out of state. They talked about destroying records and covering tracks. And they talked about me, about how I'd been acting strange lately, asking too many questions, seeming unstable, about how I might become a liability if the investigation got too close, about how they might need to make some difficult decisions about my future. That's when I knew for certain that I was running out of time, that if I didn't act soon I might end up like Carol Vance. Another tragic accident. Another problem solved with a quiet death that nobody would question too hard. But I also knew something else. They was planning one last big event before they moved their operations. Foundation Gala I'd heard Ren mention scheduled for the following Saturday. Final fundraiser to clean out their local accounts and provide cover for their departure, which meant they'd all be home Friday night, getting ready, all 5 of them together in the house, relaxed and unsuspecting, because they thought they'd outsmarted everyone who might threaten them. It would be perfect. A family dinner to celebrate their success, to toast their cleverness, to enjoy one last meal in the house where they'd built their empire of horror. I already knew what I was going to cook. Beef stew thickened, rich and dark enough to hide the bitter taste of justice. Cornbread sweet with honey to make them want seconds. Pie for dessert because that was always their favorite when they was little. A perfect last meal for 5 monsters who used to be my children. I just had to make sure I was strong enough to watch them eat it. Friday morning came bright and clear, the kind of summer day that makes you grateful to be alive. Birds were singing in the oak trees. Air smelled like honeysuckle in fresh-cut grass. And the sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows looked like liquid gold poured straight from heaven. It should have been a beautiful day. Instead, it felt like the last day of the world. I got up before dawn and sat on the back porch with my coffee, watching the sky turn from black to purple to pink. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear a church bell ringing, probably from St. Mary's down in town, calling folks to early morning prayer service. The sound made me think about confession, about absolution, about whether what I was planning to do could ever be forgiven by the Almighty. But then I thought about all them children who'd never see another sunrise, who'd never hear church bells or smell honeysuckle or feel safe in their own beds again because of what my babies had done to them. And I knew that some sins was too big for confession, too terrible for anything but justice. Spent the morning shopping for groceries, driving to 3 different stores so nobody would think twice about an old woman buying ingredients for a big family dinner. Beef for the stew, vegetables for roasting, apples for pie, normal things, innocent things that wouldn't raise no eyebrows or stick in anybody's memory. But I also made a stop at the old cemetery on Maple Hill Road, where my grandmother was buried under a weathered headstone that was starting to sink into the earth. I sat by her grave for the longest time, telling her about what I was planning, asking for her guidance one last time. The wind rustled through the grass and trees, and I swear, I heard her voice in it just like when I was little. And she'd tell me stories about the old days. She was saying that sometimes love looks like letting go, and sometimes protecting the innocent means destroying what you love most. I picked some wild herbs from around her grave, the kind she'd taught me about all them years ago, and tucked them careful like into my purse. Then I said goodbye to her and to the woman I used to be, and drove home to cook my last meal as a mother. The house was quiet when I got back. All 5 of my children was out handling last-minute business before tomorrow's gala, making sure everything was perfect for their grand finale. Had the whole afternoon to prepare, to get everything ready for what was coming. I started with the stew, browning the meat slow and careful, letting the smell fill the kitchen with something warm and homey. As I chopped vegetables, I thought about all the other family dinners I'd cooked in this kitchen. All the times I'd stood at this same stove making food to nourish the people I loved most in the world. It wasn't so different, was it? I was still cooking for my family, still trying to take care of them the only way I knew how. Still showing my love through food. Even though that love now looked like something terrible and necessary. When the stew was simmering nice and low, I started preparing the other ingredients. The ones my grandmother had taught me about. Ground them up fine as dust, mixed them careful-like into portions that would be strong enough to work, but not so strong as to change the taste much. My hands were steady as stone while I did it. No shaking, no hesitation, no second thoughts. It was like some other part of me had taken over. Some ancient part that knew exactly what needed doing and how to do it right. Around 4 o'clock I heard cars in the driveway. My children was coming home, probably hungry and tired and ready for a good meal before their big day tomorrow. I smoothed my apron, checked my hair in the hall mirror, and went to greet them like I'd done 1,000 times before. They was all in good spirits, laughing about something that had happened at their meeting, talking about how much money they expected to raise at the gala. Ren had bought a new dress for the occasion, something red and expensive that probably cost more than most folks made in a month. The boys was wearing their best suits, looking handsome and successful and proud of themselves. Looking at them, I felt my heart try to break one last time. Because they were still beautiful, wasn't they? Still my babies, even though they'd grown into monsters, still the children I'd sung to sleep and bandaged when they fell and cheered for at school plays and graduation ceremonies. But then I thought about A.R. Vance and about her grandmother who died looking for her. I thought about that empty room upstairs. And all the children who'd been brought here over the years. All the lives that had been destroyed to build my children's empire of evil. And I knew that beauty and blood connection didn't matter when weighed against justice. That being a mother meant protecting all children, not just your own. Sometimes the greatest act of love is stopping the ones you love from doing more harm. Dinner was ready by 6 o'clock. Set the table with my best china, the pattern with little blue flowers that had belonged to my own mother. I lit candles and put out cloth napkins and made everything as beautiful as I could because this was going to be our last meal together, and I wanted it to be perfect. They all complimented the food, said it was some of my best cooking ever, asked for seconds and thirds, laughed and talked and planned their future like they didn't have a care in the world. Like they'd never hurt nobody, never destroyed nothing, never turned my house into a way station for stolen children. I watched them eat and I felt something that might have been peace settling over me like a warm blanket. Because I knew that when this meal was over, when what I'd done finally took effect, there wouldn't be no more children disappearing, no more Families torn apart. No more monsters wearing the faces of my babies. It was going to cost me everything. My freedom, my future, probably my life. But it was going to save children I'd never meet. Families I'd never know. Futures that might never have existed if I'd done nothing. And that was enough. That was more than enough. That was justice. The effects started about an hour after dinner. Just as we was all sitting in the living room with coffee and my homemade apple pie. I'd been watching the clock on the mantel, counting down the minutes, knowing that what I'd done was working its way through their systems like slow, inevitable justice. Jedediah was the first to notice something was wrong. He set down his coffee cup with a shaky hand and pressed his palm against his forehead, blinking hard like he was trying to clear his vision. Then Cletus started feeling dizzy. Had to grip the arm of his chair to keep from falling over. Within minutes, all 5 of them were showing sweating, nausea, confusion that was spreading across their faces like storm clouds gathering. I sat in my rocking chair, the one I'd nursed them all in when they was babies, and watched my children begin to die. It wasn't fast and it wasn't easy. The things my grandmother had taught me about the herbs and roots I'd ground up so careful and mixed into their food. They worked slow and sure but not gentle. They was meant to give me time to say what needed saying, to make sure my children understood exactly why this was happening to them. Ren was the first to figure it out. She looked at me with eyes that was starting to lose focus and whispered something about the food, about how we'd all eaten the same thing, but only they was getting sick. Smart girl, my Ren always was the quickest of my babies. I told them everything. How I'd found that email, how I'd seen little Era brought to our house like she was cargo instead of a child. How I'd met her grandmother and watched that brave woman die for trying to save someone she loved. How I'd gone into that room upstairs and seen the carved initials, the scratches on the floor, the evidence of all the children who'd suffered while I lived in ignorance and luxury. I told them about the investigation that was closing in on them, about how they'd been planning to disappear and start their evil business somewhere else, about how many more children would have died if I'd let them live another day, another week, another year. But mostly I told them about love, about how being a mother means protecting all children, not just your about how sometimes the greatest act of love looks like the most unforgivable sin. About how I'd rather spend the rest of my life in prison than spend one more day knowing I'd raised monsters and done nothing to stop them. They tried to fight it at first. Jedediah managed to get to his feet, stumbling toward the phone like he was going to call for help. But his legs gave out before he could reach it, and he collapsed onto the Persian rug that he'd bought me for my 70th birthday. The same rug where he used to play with toy soldiers when he was 7 years old. Abner started crying, begging me to help them, to call an ambulance, to do something to stop what was happening. He sounded like the little boy he used to be, the one who was afraid of thunderstorms and monsters under the bed. But the real monster wasn't under his bed. It was inside him and had been for years. Gideon, true to his quiet nature, just looked at me with something that might have been understanding, like he knew that what I'd done was inevitable, that this moment had been coming from the second they'd chosen to become what they'd become. He closed his eyes and seemed to accept it, which broke my heart and mended it at the same time. Cletus kept trying to make deals with me, promising they'd stop their business, swearing they'd turn themselves in, saying anything he thought might save them. But we both knew he was lying. They'd never have stopped, never have felt real guilt for what they'd done. They'd have just gotten better at hiding it. And Ren, my only daughter, my little girl who used to bring me dandelions and call them beautiful flowers. She spent her last minutes telling me exactly what she thought of me, using words I'd never heard come out of her mouth before, cursing me for destroying what they'd built, calling me a crazy old woman who didn't understand the world they lived. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was crazy. But if loving children more than I loved my own flesh and blood made me crazy, then I was proud to be out of my mind. One by one they grew still. One by one the children I had brought into this world left it, taking their secrets and their sins with them. The living room that had once echoed with Christmas morning laughter and birthday celebrations became as quiet as a tomb, filled with nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the tick of that old mantel clock counting down the minutes, until I'd have to face what I'd done. When the last of them was gone, when I was sure there wasn't no coming back for any of them, I picked up the phone and dialed the sheriff's office. I was ready to confess, ready to pay the price for the justice I delivered, ready to spend whatever time I had left, knowing that no more children would disappear into that room upstairs, that no more families would be destroyed by the monsters I'd created. It was over. Finally, terribly necessarily over. When the sheriff arrived that night, I was still sitting in my rocking chair, surrounded by the bodies of my children. I'd called him myself, told him exactly what I'd done and why I'd done it, told him to come quick, that there was 5 people dead in my living room, and I was the one who'd killed them. The trial was a circus just like I'd expected. Newspapers from 3 states covered it, calling me everything from a monster to a saint, depending on which side of the story they wanted to tell. Some folks said I was a hero who'd stopped something unspeakable. Others said I was a crazy old woman who'd murdered her own family in cold blood. The prosecution painted me as exactly what I was, a mother who'd poisoned her children with malice of forethought. They had the evidence. They had my confession. They had everything. They needed to put me away for the rest of my natural life. They didn't much care about my reasons, about what my children had been doing, about the evil I'd stopped. All they cared about was that I'd killed 5 people and admitted to it. My court-appointed lawyer tried to get me to plead insanity, said no jury would believe a sane woman would poison her own babies. But I wouldn't do it. I wasn't crazy and I wasn't sorry. I'd done what needed doing and I wanted the world to know it. A jury deliberated for 3 days before they came back with their verdict. Guilty on all 5 counts of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced me to life in prison without the possibility of parole. What I'd done was beyond redemption, beyond understanding, beyond any excuse the law could recognize. I accepted my sentence with dignity, walked out of that courtroom in shackles, ready to spend whatever time I had left paying for the justice I delivered. But prison taught me things I hadn't expected to learn. Taught me that even behind bars, even locked away from the world, truth has a way of working itself to the surface like groundwater after a long drought. It was about 3 years into my sentence when the first package arrived. No return address, no note, just a manila envelope with my name written in careful block letters. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a city 4 states away. The headline read, "Child trafficking ring exposed. Dozens of victims rescued." The article talked about an investigation that had been going on for years, following money trails and missing children reports across multiple states. They'd finally broken the case wide open when they raided a compound in Nevada, and found 37 children being held in conditions that made my stomach turn, even after everything I'd seen. But the most important part was buried in the middle of the article. The investigators had traced the operation back to its source, a company called Pinnacle Holdings and a charity called the Hearthlight Foundation. They'd found records going back over a decade, evidence of hundreds of children who'd been trafficked, sold, destroyed by the network my children had built. They called it one of the largest child trafficking operations in the country's history. Said the organization had been so sophisticated, so well connected that it might have continued operating indefinitely if not for the sudden death of its leadership. The sudden death of its leadership. That was me. That was what I'd done on that Friday night when I'd served my children their last meal. More packages came over the years, more newspaper clippings, more evidence of the scope of what my children had been doing, stories about children being reunited with families, about survivors getting therapy and new lives, about investigations that were finally able to move forward because the people who'd been covering their tracks was dead. But the package that changed everything came in my 7th year of prison. This one had a return address, a law office in the state capital. Inside was a letter from a lawyer named Catherine Vance, along with something that made my hands shake so bad I nearly dropped it. It was a toxicology report, not the one from my trial but a different one. A complete analysis of my children's blood that had been suppressed during my prosecution. And what it showed was impossible, unthinkable, but absolutely true. Children had been sedated before they died. Heavily sedated with drugs I'd never heard of. Drugs I couldn't have. Drugs that had been in their systems for hours before they'd ever sat down to my poisoned dinner. Someone else had drugged them first. Someone who'd wanted them unconscious, helpless when the poison I'd given them finally took effect. Someone who'd made sure they couldn't fight back, couldn't run, couldn't do anything but lie there and die slow like they deserved. The letter explained everything. Catherine Vance was Carol Vance's daughter, the mother of Little, the woman who'd been looking for her child when my children had her killed. She was also the medical examiner who'd handled my case, who'd done the autopsies on my children. She'd known exactly what they were. Had been investigating them for months before that Friday night, trying to build a case that would stick. She'd seen me getting closer to the truth. Had watched me struggle with what I was learning about my babies. And when she'd realized what I was planning to do, she'd helped me. Had made sure my children couldn't escape what was coming. Couldn't hurt me to stop me. Couldn't do anything but accept the justice they'd been avoiding for so long. She hadn't been able to save her daughter, Era. That precious child had disappeared into their network and was probably dead long before I'd ever seen her. But she'd been able to make sure the people who killed her paid the price and that no other children would suffer the same fate. I wasn't the only one who'd wanted my children dead. I was just the one who'd been willing to sacrifice everything to make it happen. The letter also told me something else. Something that made me cry for the first time since my arrest. Hillerance was alive. She'd been found at that compound in Nevada, traumatized and broken but breathing. She was getting help now, getting therapy, learning to be a child again instead of merchandise. She was safe. They was all safe now. Because Five Monsters was dead and their network had crumbled without them to hold it together. I'm getting out next week after 10 years behind bars. They're finally letting me go home. Not because I've been pardoned or because anyone thinks I was justified in what I done. I'm getting out because I'm dying. They don't want an old woman's death on their conscience. Cancer. The doctors say spreading fast. Through what's left of me. I got maybe 6 months if I'm lucky, 3 if I ain't. But that's long enough. Long enough to sit on a porch again to smell honeysuckle and hear church bells and feel sunshine on my face. Long enough to know that the choice I made on that Friday night, the choice that cost me everything I thought I loved, was the right one. Sometimes justice looks like poison. Sometimes love looks like murder. Sometimes the only way to save the innocent is to destroy what created. I'd do it again tomorrow if I had to. And I'd sleep sound afterward, knowing that somewhere out there, children are safe in their beds because I found the courage to stop the monsters wearing my babies' faces. If you're listening to this story, if my words have found their way to your heart, then maybe you understand something about the choices we make when there ain't no good options left. Maybe you know something about love that's bigger than blood, about justice that's more important than family. I'm still here for a little while longer, and I want to hear from you. Want to know what city you're watching this from. Want to know if my story means something to someone besides just me. If it moved you, if it made you think about the children in your own community who might need protecting, then maybe you could share it with someone else who needs to hear it. Because every voice matters. When it comes to protecting the innocent, every person who's willing to stand up and say, "Not on my watch," makes the world a little bit safer for the ones who can't protect themselves. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories like mine. Stories about ordinary people who found the courage to do extraordinary things when the world needed them to. And remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is the one that damns you forever. The story continues in the next chapter in the next linked video. But first, I need you to subscribe to join the family as we are looking forward to hit our first 10,000 subscribers target, and feel free to share your story in the comments. You matter, your voice does too.